Chapter 4. Fleeing Home. On my way back to Lhasa from Gangtok, I stopped in many places trying to reassure my countrymen, only to receive increasingly disquieting reports. I arrived in the capital on April 1st, 1957, knowing that the situation was slipping out of control due to the Chinese government's actions and from my own inability to have any meaningful influence. By midsummer, it had become clear that virtually everything I had been told by Zhou himself and by him on behalf of Mao had been falsehoods and dissimulations. There continued to be open conflict in Kham and Amdo, eastern and northeastern Tibet. The People's Liberation Army showed no restraint, bombing more towns and committing such atrocities that I found difficult to believe for their levels of depravity, but were later confirmed by the International Commission of Jurists in 1959. Forced sterilization, crucifixion, vivisection, disemboweling, dismemberment, beheading, burning, beating to death, burying alive, dragging people behind galloping horses, hanging them upside down, and other horrors. Thousands more refugees from Kham and Amdo fled to Lhasa and camped outside the city. Through 1958 and early 1959, the situation worsened further, with growing numbers joining an active Tibetan resistance that came to be based in southern Tibet, called the Volunteer Force for the Protection of the Faith, Tensung Danglang Magmi, led by the energetic leader Adruk Gompo Tashi. To diffuse tension, I had several meetings with the People's Liberation Army's senior-most generals in Lhasa, including especially General Tan Guansan, the head of the Chinese military in Tibet, known for his bad temper. Through these generals, the Chinese government insisted that the Tibetan government use our own Tibetan soldiers against the Tibetan guerrillas. It was unthinkable to send Tibetan troops against our own people, especially when they were fighting to safeguard our land and culture. At the same time, I received an intimation from the Americans that if I solicited assistance for the resistance movement, they would provide it. Of course, as a student of the Buddha and a deep admirer of Mahatma Gandhi's non-violence philosophy, I could not imagine myself making such a request. Part of me at the time, I must admit, admired the guerrilla fighters. They were brave Tibetans who were putting their lives at risk for the sake of our nation and Buddhist faith. I also knew that many of them saw themselves as fighting out of loyalty to me as the Dalai Lama. I wondered what advice Mahatma Gandhi would have given me in this charged situation. Would he have condoned violence here? I could not believe that he would. Practically speaking, too, I was convinced that using force against the Chinese would be not only useless, but actually suicidal. It would give the Chinese army the perfect excuse to crush Tibetans with maximum force. In the midst of all this, I was preparing for my final Geshe-l-Haram exams, scheduled at the Great Prayer Festival of 1959. February 22nd, 1959, when I formally sat for my examination debates at the Great Yokhang Temple in Lhasa, was a rare break from the incessant and challenging politics. The day I completed my formal Geshe debates was, perhaps, the happiest day of my life. It was the culmination of a series of debates I had participated in at the three great seats of learning, Sera, Drepung, and Ganden, the three largest monastic universities of the Gelug school in central Tibet, all established at the beginning of the 15th century. I was both excited and nervous about the debates at Tibet's great centers of learning. Later, I found out that those who had been chosen to question me at these debates too were quite nervous, if not more so than me. Following my final Geshe exams in Lhasa, over the next 2 weeks, the crisis in the country reached a boiling point. The people's anxiety about my own safety and the presence of Chinese troops in Lhasa led to an explosive situation in the capital. With so many people gathered in one place, several thousand Tibetans from other parts of Tibet, in addition to the local residents, and with such a large number of People's Liberation Army soldiers stationed in the city, there was a pervasive sense of nervousness and unease. Many felt something untoward was about to happen. On March 10th, I was supposed to attend a cultural show at the Chinese garrison in Lhasa, with the worrisome suggestion that my bodyguards should not accompany me. Word had gotten out, and thousands of people crowded the city to prevent me from leaving my residence at Norbalinka. The crowd grew through the day, with people shouting anti-Chinese slogans and saying that they would not allow the Dalai Lama to leave. It was soon out of control and became a massive popular uprising. Over the next few days, the situation became increasingly tense and chaotic, with the crowd refusing to disperse. On the 12th, thousands of Tibetan women took to the streets and assembled in front of the Potala Palace. They burned the Chinese flag, as well as photos and effigies of Mao, Zhou Enlai, and Jude, and shouted, "Tibet has always been free, Tibet for the Tibetans. Long live the Dalai Lama, long live Garden Phodrang," the last being the name of the Tibetan government under the Dalai Lamas. The leader of this women's protest, Gurten Kunsang, and some of her colleagues would be later executed by firing squad. On March 14th, I met with approximately 70 representatives chosen by the people in the hope that I could help diffuse the situation. However, tension kept building, with the Tibetan crowds growing day by day. From the 10th to the 17th of March, the Chinese army remained in its barracks while I exchanged messages with the short-tempered General Tan Guansan, which may have helped to buy time. My last letter to him was on March 16th. It might also have been the case that the Chinese army was awaiting instructions from Beijing. We had information that they were planning to attack the crowd and shell the Norbulinka Palace. Within my own immediate circle, many were urging me to seriously consider leaving Lhasa for the time being. But I kept hoping that if we could find a way to reassure the mass of ordinary Tibetans gathered outside who were worried about my safety, we could somehow diffuse the situation and avert an immediate explosion. On the 17th, around 4 p.m., 2 heavy mortars landed just outside the north side of the Norbulinka, which, fortunately, did not cause any harm. Everyone thought that an attack was imminent. Earlier on that day, the state oracle Nechung, in a trance, had in fact urged me to leave, saying, "Leave, leave, go tonight." This instruction was consistent with the outcome of a few divinations I had performed myself on the question of whether to stay or leave. So, the landing of those 2 mortars came as a reinforcement of what the state oracle had instructed me to do, namely, to leave immediately. Not only was my own life in danger, but the lives of thousands of my people now seemed certain to be lost as well. With everyone around me urging the path of escape as well, I took the decision to flee Lhasa. I went to the chapel of Mahakala, an important protector in Tibetan Buddhism, a chapel where I had always gone to say goodbye before embarking on a long journey. The monks there must have been a little surprised when I offered a long white scarf to the image, but they did not show it. Then, having changed my monastic robe into layman's clothing, I went to my prayer room to sit down for a quiet moment. I opened the text that was lying on the small table in front of the throne, which turned out to be the 8,000 lines on the perfection of wisdom, a scripture sacred to Mahayana Buddhism. I randomly picked up a page and read from the top, ending at the sentence, "Have courage and confidence." Energized, I closed the book, blessed the room, and turned off the lights. One precious item I took with me was an old thanka, a traditional Tibetan painting on canvas framed with silk brocades that could be rolled into a scroll, that had belonged to the second Dalai Lama. Star. As I walked out of my room, a blanket of silence enveloped me, where I could feel every step I took and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I took the rifle of one of the bodyguards who was standing outside my room. And so, at 10 p.m. on March 17th, I put my glasses into my pocket and stepped out of the Norbolinka Palace, disguised as a layman with a rifle over my shoulder. This was a truly eerie experience. I was afraid, but also had a more immediate practical thing to worry about: how not to trip as I walked without my glasses. As I stepped out of the gate, I felt the presence of a great mass of people gathered outside the Norbolinka. Thinking of them, I prayed, worrying what fate lay in store for these thousands of innocent Tibetans. After I left, the Tibetan government in Lhasa continued as if I were still in residence. Once we were away from the immediate threat of being captured by the People's Liberation Army, personally, the most powerful thing I felt was a sense of relief. Alongside this was the acute awareness that I was now free to speak my mind and openly criticize the policies of the communist Chinese government. This feeling of freedom was so vivid and strong. The 9 years of working with the communist Chinese in Tibet and Beijing, during which I had to carefully consider every phrase I uttered, had placed a heavy weight in my heart, and I was now able to breathe the air of freedom. Early the next morning, as we were crossing the Chela Pass, one of the guides leading my horse told me that this was the last point from where we could still see the Potala Palace, with its striking white and red fortress-like structures covering the entire face of a rocky mountain overlooking Lhasa. He then helped turn my horse around so I could take a last glimpse. With a heavy heart, I said goodbye to Lhasa, Tibet's capital city, where I had grown up since age 4. I prayed that I would be able to return there one day. A few days later, on March 20th, the Chinese army shelled the Norbolinka and the crowd, killing many. By that time, the People's Liberation Army had a well-integrated plan of attack. When I heard this news from a messenger during my escape, I prayed for my people. Nobody knows exactly how many were killed in Lhasa. I was told that thousands of bodies were seen inside and outside the Norbolinka. What took place in Norbolinka, Lhasa, Chokpori, a hill opposite Lhasa and the site of the Tibetan Medical School, and Sera Monastery over 2 days of relentless bombing, was a massacre. We made for Lunsidzong in Loka, in the south, which is just on the Tibetan side of the border from India. Our original intention was not to go directly into exile to India. My idea was to negotiate with the Chinese from a place of safety, to see if I could return, to continue to lead the Tibetan government. However, as the news of what took place in the immediate aftermath of my flight and what was continuing to happen reached us, we became convinced that there was no point in talking with the People's Republic of China. Furthermore, the Chinese authorities in Lhasa had announced the dissolution of the Tibetan government. I later heard that when Mao was informed of my escape, he reacted, "We have lost." Mao probably realized that with me gone out of Tibet, China would struggle with the question of legitimacy both of their authority and their presence in Tibet. He was right. This question of legitimacy still remains at the very heart of China's presence in Tibet, even after 7 decades of occupation. At Lunsidzong, we paused and took stock. Looking back at more than 8 years since the 17-point agreement was signed, and notably after my return from visiting China in 1954 to 1955 and India in 1956 to 1957, despite all the efforts I made to find an accommodation, it was clear to me that the task was simply impossible. There is an old Tibetan saying that captures the essence of the relationship between the Tibetans and the Chinese. Tibetans are let down by their hopes. The Chinese are let down by their suspicions. At Lun Sezong, on March 26, 1959, I formally repudiated the 17-point agreement and announced the reconstitution of our own government of Tibet as the only legally constituted authority for the country. More than 1,000 people attended this ceremony, where Surkang, one of the ministers in my cabinet, read the document aloud to the gathering. At the opening of this document, announcing the formation of Tibet's legitimate government, the text stated, "In the past, for several thousand years, this snowland of Tibet was widely known as an independent country that was ruled by a system that combines the religious and the secular. Except for the differences between a big and a small country, we have identical attributes, greatness and qualifications for being an independent country in the world." The concluding part of the text makes the call that as soon as people see this edict, which contains the good news about setting up a new state called Gaden Phodrang, you should publicize it to all the monks and lay people in your area and make sure they have heard it. Copies of the proclamation of Tibet's independent government, with my signature, were dispatched across Tibet, with one sent to the Panchen Lama. At this point, reports of Chinese troops nearby precipitated the decision to cross the border into India. I had the difficult task of bidding farewell to the Tibetan soldiers and resistance fighters who had so faithfully escorted me from Lhasa and who were now about to turn back to face the Chinese army. I knew that some were returning to certain death. They were going back to rejoin the volunteer force for the protection of the faith. As part of the US government's overall strategy to prevent the spread of communism in Asia, as later I came to know, the Tibetan resistance movement led by Gompo Tashi did actually receive some support from the CIA, including a handful of them getting communication and combat training. From Lun Sezong, we decided to head toward the Indian border. After 2 days of hard riding, we reached Mang Mang, which is the last Tibetan village before the border of India. There, to my delight, was one of the officials I had sent earlier to inquire if India would receive me and my entourage. He brought the good news that the government of India was willing to grant asylum to me and my people. That night at Mang Mang, I felt quite safe. For the first time in many days, there was only one track leading to this place, and that route was well guarded by several hundred Tibetan resistance fighters. So unless the Chinese army bombed us from the air, I knew we were safe. But the weather wasn't so kind. It rained heavily, and my tent was leaking pretty much everywhere. I was forced to sit up the entire night, with the result that I caught a cold the next day. With me being ill, we had to postpone our remaining trek to the border for 2 days. Still too sick to ride a horse. When we did move finally, I was placed on a dzo, a cross between a yak and cow. In this way, I left the last stretch of my own homeland. On March 31st, 1959, my party entered India. I have not been able to go back to my homeland since.